Water rights in New Mexico, what you need to know and what you care about. It's really an important subject. And if you want to know more, stay tuned to this episode. The Den, powered by the Lyons Group, a show dedicated to exploring hot topics in real estate, local happenings, and industry trends. We're a small team of professionals approaching $400 million in sales and nearly 2,000 local transactions. You're listening to time-tested experts and industry leaders. Here's a refreshing look at real estate happenings and more. Welcome to The Den. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Den. And today we're going to be talking about water rights, what you should know as a seller, and truth be told, what you should be asking about as a buyer if you're purchasing a property with water rights. But before we get started, we are the Lyons Group and we're powering The Den, the podcast. I want to introduce some of my very best friends and partners of the Lyons Group. To my left, Paul, hand me the rock berry. Melissa, let's go, Glasgow, Aspen, the ninja Groen, and Shannon, the boss, Martin Martinez. My name is Ben Lyons, and I'm your host today at The Den, and all things water rights. I mean, this is a hot topic in the area that we live in, obviously the Four Corners region, and specifically northern New Mexico. There's some uncertainty around water. I mean, it's a confusing topic, right? So there are things that we're going to discuss today that you're probably going to go, okay, I need more information about that. And of course, as professionals, we're always trying to learn and understand the rules and regulations around water rights because they vary from state to state. Paul, what are your thoughts there?
I'm just going to say, first and foremost, we are not experts.
Yeah.
So anything that we say, don't hold us against us. This is the best of our knowledge. If you want to know more about water rights or to see if you have water rights or anything like that, go to the appropriate people. The New Mexico Water Department.
Well, you have the state engineer and NASDAQ is really the authoritarian body for that.
I would say information, get it from the source. We are the source of the source. So the state engineer's office.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So as a seller, Paul, if you have water rights or you think you have water rights, let's just say you don't know for certain, what should you do in that regard?
Call the state engineer.
Call the state engineer. So figure out what you have. I mean, that should be basic step number one.
Right. And there are different, like if you have acreage and you irrigate it, that could be from numerous different things. You could have ditch irrigation. You could have a well. There are plenty of that. You need to know exactly how you get your water, who you're paying for your water, how much water you can use, all of those things. And those are definitely the state engineers. In a real estate transaction, all that should be found in your inspection period. And if you're a seller and you are advertising that you have water rights, you need to know what kind that you have, how that's going to convey.
Yeah. So if you're a seller and you've been just using water all these years, but you really don't know what you have, I mean, your very first step is go down to the state engineer, have a conversation, understand you've been paying $150 a year for water rights, but you just don't know how many irrigated feet do you have? Are they opportunities to the property? Are they actually owned by the ditch? There's a lot of facets to that. So understand first and foremost what you have by the authority here locally. And then you can go from there. You can build value around that. Correct. So Melissa, what are your thoughts as a seller? What would you be?
Well, I think just to kind of piggyback off of what Paul said about knowing exactly what you have, just because the equipment's there doesn't mean you have the rights. That you might have a family property and, well, grandpa always, irrigated everything. And then when he passed and then my dad did it and now it's my house. Well, do you really have the rights to that? Or are you using somebody else's water? Because at some point in time, the hammer might fall, right?
Yeah.
And say, no, this is not yours. So yeah. I would say it's just very important. If you're advertising that you have something, do your work too, because that could be something that will come back to bite you. If you are saying, yes, I have water rights and I'm going to list it for this price, buyer finds out there's no water rights, your value just went down.
Yeah, tremendous. In fact, you just touched on something that we experienced years ago. We have these forms that we use. They're called the disclaimer disclosure forms. Well, we didn't have them in the early 2000s. They were created because of several incidences. One was mold. That's a whole nother topic. But specifically water rights. And the catalyst for that was there was a specific case here locally where a gentleman had been pumping water out of this ditch for 40 years. I mean, decades. And he represented to the buyer, hey, I've been paying, I've been not paying for it, but I've been pumping water out of this ditch. I have irrigation. And they advertised it as irrigation. Well, the buyer closed on the property under the guise that this property had irrigation. They started rebuilding that, a pump, and doing some things to it. And a neighbor came over and said, hey, you don't have irrigation. And he said, what do you mean? And so that created the new form. It always takes an instance like that where you go, oh my gosh, here we go. And really it's on the buyer also to verify those water rights. Aspen, what are your thoughts on that?
Whenever it comes to water rights, I always think you need to do more research than you typically would. Water rights, especially in this high desert area, are so important. And even just because you're used to one way doesn't mean it's the same everywhere. Just going across the state line, 30 minutes away, they have a completely different system for how their water is determined. So whenever I'm listing a home in Colorado and they say they have water rights, I always want to know how far in line they are. Because if you're 10th in line and the river runs low, you're not getting water. So I think it's really important for buyers to know how often are you getting it? What are you actually getting? Not just what the rights are, especially in Colorado. And then as far as New Mexico or anywhere really, is it flowing stream? Is it lake access? What access do you actually have? Can you fish? Can you boat? Or do you just, can you just look at it? So
Is it just pretty?
Just access. Yeah. So I think the access is also really important. What you can and can't do. Talking to a water rights lawyer, the state engineer, Colorado Division of Water Resources, you have to talk to people who are really, really knowledgeable about your specific property because it varies so much dependent on where you are, even town to town, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a good point. I mean, there's a lot of different ditches that are operated independently. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have the Bloomfield irrigation ditch, you have the Halford ditch. You have all these different ditches. And some of those ditches retain the water rights in the ditch itself. Mm-hmm. And you, as someone who irrigates from that, access those, that you almost lease those water rights from the ditch. Mm-hmm. The ditch company is a co-op. So everyone kind of owns that, but at the same time, you don't have a specific share. You can access that based on the size of your parcel. So there are different rules and regulations that govern those ditches.
If they're deeded or if they're irrigation, if they're deeded, you need to make sure you transfer the ownership because you could retain those. So a seller could sell the property and not sell the water rights versus irrigation. It's going to stick with the property. So it's really important to know you can't just advertise, I don't think, water rights. You might have a right to water, but what does that actually mean?
Sure. And you're absolutely right in the sense that water rights could be treated as a commodity, right? Mm-hmm. You could have excessive water rights that you're not using and actually, segregate some of those off and sell them. So from a buyer's standpoint, Shannon, what are your thoughts? What should they be thinking about if they're purchasing from a ditch? What would be the steps that you would take as a buyer?
The first thing I would do is call the ditch company. I would call whoever provides that water, and I would find out, how many months out of the year you have access to the water. I would find out what it costs. I would find out what you needed to do to transfer it. I think it's important for people to know that the way that it's usually worded is what you own is not water. You own the beneficial use of the water. So that use can be taken away at any time. These companies could decide that there is, some farmland that's more beneficial to the community, and they need to divert some of that there, and they're going to take away from some because you're using it for your yard and you haven't had a yard in 4 years.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people don't always keep up on that and understand that, if you're going to have those rights to the usage, you should use it. You should stay current on it. You should transfer it and make sure it's in your name. There's some things you need to do to make sure that you retain that.
Yeah. And I think you make a good distinction. So if you're purchasing a property that's on a ditch, you should talk to the ditch writer themselves or the ditch company, right? Mm-hmm. And understand what their bylaws are. They have their rules and bylaws and how they operate. Because like you said, and what Aspen alluded to was if they run short on water, where's the priority, right? If you're watering your grass, that's probably lower on the priority than if you're watering livestock. Yeah. And so they have rules that will govern that versus what we were talking about. If you buy property with actual opportunity irrigation rights that could be treated as a commodity. So those are two separate things. You need to understand that. So not only talk to the ditch company, but also the state engineer, because the state engineer is the ultimate resource for the water rights. They have all the historic maps and they can go back quite a bit of time. What are your thoughts, Paul, on as a seller advertising like, hey, I've got 7 acres with irrigation, or I've got 7 acres of irrigation? What's the difference?
Well, when I do listings with land and irrigation, I tried to tell them, give me all the information up front.
Yeah.
And then we advertise exactly what it is. Because if you just say water rights, just like Aspen said, there's so many different things it could be. And you don't want to get to closing or to when you get the title binder and find out you don't have rights to the water. This is leased water. So as a seller, know exactly what it is, have all the information up front. Don't make a buyer go and chase it down.
If you're going to market your property, let's say you're going to market, right? And you have 7 acres and you have irrigation with that. Is it better to say, hey, I have 7 acres with irrigation, or I have 7 irrigated acres?
I think I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is that you can have a 7-acre parcel that has 1 acre of irrigation.
Right.
And so if we use the terms loosely and we start saying things like, well, we have 7 irrigated acres with this home, that's probably not true. You
Flooding
probably
your
have,
house.
you probably have.
You're not
7
watering under your house. Hopefully you're
Yeah,
not anyways,
totally.
right?
You probably have 7 acres and a house on it, and you might have 1 acre of irrigation with it. And that's an important distinction to make. Most people, an average person buying a house maybe doesn't know, maybe doesn't care, but it does matter when you realize you're talking about what you're actually purchasing and what you're going to own.
Yeah.
It could make a big difference. If you had 75 acres and 1 acre of irrigation with it, that might not be very beneficial.
Yeah.
But if you had, 1 acre with 2 irrigated acres,
Yeah.
that's it that you
Sure.
purchased.
Yeah.
That I'm just giving examples
Sure.
there. That's not really realistic.
Well, you have more irrigation than
what you
is
need.
allowed for the land.
Exactly,
Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
You can't
So-
use that much irrigation.
So it does matter when you're purchasing something to know that irrigation may not even be useful to you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. What about in town? Any, some people have irrigation in town, which
Mhm.
is shocking in Farmington.
That's
and
because they've
Bluefield.
done the right thing.
Yeah.
They have kept their irrigation rights and they've made sure to transfer them properly and made sure to hold on
Yeah.
to them and made sure to use them over the years. That's why you find something right in the middle of town that has irrigation when nothing else around it does.
Yeah.
They've done the right thing.
Yeah. And how important is that to value?
Mhm.
I mean, irrigation could really turn the knob on your value.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that at the end. That's the speed round coming up.
Well, the difference between using city water to water your lawn or using the house as opposed to irrigation is a huge cost every year.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are your thoughts on those that have irrigation that they pump right out of a ditch versus going ahead and diverting that to a well where you pop a well in the ground, the water filtrates into that well and you pump out of the well? Any pros or cons to that?
Yeah, there's definitely pros to it. I mean, you can filter it easier. You can hook it up to a sprinkler system a lot easier. You're not having to go out there and do the flood irrigation. So there's a lot of pros to wells. We all know well water here can be pretty heavy in minerals. So that's
Yeah.
pretty hard on, especially if you're using it inside of a house. It can be really hard on appliances and things like that. So there's definitely pros to actually putting in the work to get a well and divert it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think, and I've experienced this with sellers before. I'm like, well, how's the irrigation work? And they're out there and they show, how, and they're like, once a year, twice a year, I've got to unclog the crawdads that get into them. I'm like, crawdads in your, what are you doing with crawdads in your sprinkler heads, right? Like, how do these things, and then of course you bring in the seeds that spread goat heads or whatever else that you may not want in your grass or in your fields or whatever else. So I think if you can divert the water to a well, it's an advantageous move to make as a seller. I had an instance where there was a large tract of land. I want to say it was about 50 acres. And part of it was on the river and the other part ran along the ditch. Well, over the years, those owners had divided that land off, 10 acres here, 5 acres there. And so I'm dealing with a parcel that was over here near, or actually on the river, but had no physical access to the irrigation ditch itself.
Mhm.
So I made a call to the state engineer and said, hey, they have water rights, correct? Can you verify that? Yes, they have water rights. Well, can they get it out of the river? Can you just put a pump in the river? And the state engineer said, absolutely not. You cannot put a pump into the river. he said it's a full permitting process to come anywhere near that. In fact, if you own land and you're adjacent to the river and you want to build a pond, collect water and pump out of that, that's a whole permitted process. Now, back in the day, they used to do that. In fact, I was just speaking with the state engineer earlier, and he said the P is a dirty word. The pond is a dirty word. So if you try to do that, if you're an owner that's trying to do that, trust me, they have satellites. They look at things like that. And if it's an unpermitted pond, you do not want to go down that road, nor can you just throw a pump in the river. Hey, I own part of the river. I'm going to throw a pump in that and pump out my irrigation. That is not allowed anymore. Now, there are permits where people do pump out of the river. Don't make that mistake that doesn't happen. But it's a permitted deal. And they've gone back and they've tried to clean all of that up. So I asked him, I said, we're in a rock and a hard place here. They have river access they can't pump out of. They can't dig a pond, and they can't access the irrigation ditch because it's too far away. What are our options? And he said exactly what you had said. It's a commodity. They could sell that irrigation, right? Someone could take that and use it. Or they could trade that irrigation right to that ditch in for a diversion point. And a diversion point can be, hey, I'm going to give you this right back, but I'm going to take a diversion point and drill a well on my property and use that. So that's very, very viable, and it's certainly flexible. And a lot of sellers should know that that's a possibility. But as always, verify, verify, verify. Now, we're still a little bit of Wild West here in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. I asked the state engineer about metering irrigation. And have you all dealt with metering irrigation at all? So it's a concept that is very prevalent in some of these other states, but it's coming to New Mexico, and it should be something that is on our radar. But he's basically said, if you apply for a permit to drill a well and it's for domestic use, in other words, if you have an acre of land and you want to water your land, they will likely issue you a permit as long as you're not in an area that prohibits that. And then also if you have livestock, if you have domestic livestock. So you could have up to 2 wells on your property that you can pump out of. So a great amenity, if you don't have a well and you're kind of in an area that you could use it, the state engineer for less than $200 will issue you a permit if you meet their qualifications. So
good for taxes as well. If you can get it zoned as agriculture, part of your property is ag.
Yeah.
Multiple benefits.
Absolutely. What are some of the things that you would think a seller, if they do have irrigation, they haven't really used it yet, what would increase the value of their property? What should they be thinking or should be on their radar? Installing the irrigation equip? Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, see if the equipment is in working order.
Yeah. Get it functionable, underground if possible. I mean, that's a big upgrade to get irrigation because you have the big rollers, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, you've been out to properties before, Paul, where you go out there and you go, okay, you've got irrigation, but this is like a hodgepodge of...
Or they're all lying in a pile by the fence.
Yeah, no one knows, unless you're that's your vein.
And that rusty stump under the bucket, that's where it comes in.
That's where
Yeah, I would say make sure, because inspections, when you have inspections, a buyer's home inspection does not ever include the irrigation, the sprinkler systems, anything like that. Mm-hmm. So if you're selling the property, it might not be a bad idea, especially if it's in warmer seasons, to have it ready to go just so you can show how it works, show that it all works. Mm-hmm. Then it is an asset that'll help you sell the house.
Yeah.
And on that note too, a well test. I've had a couple of properties in the last few years that they wanted a well test on it.
Sure.
Oh gosh, where do you even get that? You know? So if you're getting ready to list your property, you may as well start in getting some of that stuff done. Like we talked about doing a pre-inspection for your home.
Yeah.
Start getting on the ball with these kind of things that a buyer's likely going to ask for.
Yeah. Yep.
I would always get a well inspection.
Yes.
Always.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
I think they might be required by certain loan types.
There is a distinction. Yeah. If you are using well water.
For your potable water.
Yeah. Yes. Then you have to have a potability test, especially with like VA, FHA. I don't know if conventional would require that. But you do have to have a potability test to make sure that the water is not contaminated, that what you're using for your drinking water and to use on your daily basis is water that is, works for the property. Now, if it's just a well for watering around the house, that is something that you don't necessarily have to, test the potability on. However, you do want to maybe test the flow.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So have you had some experience with that, Aspen?
Yeah, we have a property with a well, and ton of houses in Colorado have wells. We always want to know how many gallons per minute it's pumping. It's just really important to know, especially if it's going to be running a house, especially if it's a large house. You want to know that you can take a shower and then fill up your pot of coffee,
Yeah.
Especially if you have like kids and they're taking long showers. It's really important to know what your flow is for water. And if there's any heavy minerals, if there's any filtration systems in there. I mean, all of this is going to add value to your property. So the more you know when it comes to your water, especially in this area, is better. And we all, I would say pretty much anywhere, we all know beachfront properties sell higher. We don't have to live near an ocean to know that.
Sure.
Water is an important commodity that we all want access to.
Yeah. Yeah. And newsflash, wells dry up.
They do.
Right. So you absolutely, especially if you are dependent on that and not on a water users association, if you're out in the county or on city water, if you're dependent on that water, you definitely want to get a flow test to understand how deep the well is, and go from there. So.
And also something to consider is usually most of these properties, if you're depending on a well for your drinking water, you're probably far enough out. You don't have, city utilities of any sort. And you're probably also on a septic system.
Yeah.
And that's always a big problem that we run into is people that in the past have put the septic system too close to the well and you're contaminating your drinking water.
Yes.
And that's a problem we've run into in the past. And, which are you going to move your well or are you going to move your septic?
Septic. Yeah.
And neither is going to be.
Yeah.
So, but you're going to have to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. We have ran into that many times.
Yeah, many times.
Where the well is too close to the leach field of the septic and now you have contamination issues and these things aren't discovered because grandpa put this in back in the 70s and it's not something now we're bringing things up to code. And now whose responsibility is it to transfer the water at some point a transaction is consummated?
The buyer.
Yeah.
I mean, the seller can walk away from their rights, but if the buyer never actually goes and claims those rights, they'll, the likely could be taken away.
Yeah. So that's a key
Your
point.
Responsibility.
Never assume that those water rights have just actually been transferred over to you. You have to go down there and sign the proper documentation to do that. Anything else we should know about, like tap fees, anything like that may be surprising to people, or transfer fees?
I think a lot of the ditch companies vary. So find out who your ditch company is and call them and ask them how much the fees are. Make sure there's no amounts in arrears that the new customer might have to be responsible for. So everybody is, ending their chapter and starting their chapter with clean slates.
Excellent point.
And while it's a buyer's responsibility, the seller is really, if you're listing your home and you have irrigation, you should be filling out how much is the transfer fee going to be? How often do you use it? You should be able to just give this. If you're using it often, I do think, even though it is a buyer's responsibility, the sellers should, it makes it seem like, oh, here it is. It's easy to use. Otherwise, people get nervous because they are so complicated, really.
And that's a great point. I mean, the part of prepping the selling of your home should be to understand all of that and be as transparent. Ultimately, it's the buyer's responsibility.
Right. Yeah.
But a prudent seller should have that information available for a buyer to review and understand during, like Paul said this several times, understand during the due diligence period what they are purchasing and what they have and what they don't have. So great discussion today on water rights. We're going to wrap it up with the speed round. I love this part, but this one especially is a loaded question. And this is going to land all over the board and it's going to vary. But the speed round question today is, what is your best guess? All things considered equal, right? Let's just use a 2,000 square foot house on an acre. One has irrigation and one does not. Identical properties. What would be the increase or the potential increase in value?
Where's the house?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Too many variables here.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say this. It's on the corridor between Aztec to Durango, up to the state, anywhere up to the state line, not up on the Mesa or anything like that. Shannon, you want to go first?
You want to know what the
potential percent increase in value.
Okay, do you actually have a number on this? And I'm guessing.
No.
When these out, I can't be wrong.
Just remember, we are not experts.
We are not experts at all. This is all hyperbole, right?
I don't know. I maybe a 10%, increase in value, maybe.
Okay, so if you had a $300,000 home that with irrigation, you could say reasonably that it would sell for $330,000 versus a home without irrigation that would be 300,000. I think that's
I think that's fair.
yeah. Aspen, what are your thoughts?
There's so many variables.
Hey, this is it's like a loaded baked potato.
Is it a pond? What's going on with the irrigation? Is it underground? Is it a well? Is it river access? Like, what are these?
Yeah. Is there clutter in the house?
Yeah.
Just answer the question.
I was going to say probably about 10%, but if it's a riverfront property, I mean, it could versus like it could like double the cost.
A riverfront property, yeah.
Like it depends what.
Now remember, all things in this situation, all things remain equal. So if it's a riverfront with with irrigation,
so just without,
yeah,
I would say probably about 10%. I'd agree.
Okay, Melissa, your thoughts?
I was going to say the same thing, but also on the flip side, we have encountered some properties in San Juan County that have zero water.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to sell a property at top dollar and you have to truck your water in for your drinking water and for your animals and for any gardens,
it could be a detriment.
It's a detriment.
Yeah. So you actually went the other way with that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, interesting.
It could be a lot more than 10% lower in value if you don't have water. Absolutely.
If you're hauling water and you have no access to water. Yeah. Okay. Interesting point. Paul Berry, round us out here.
I think, it depends on the buyer too. If the buyer's really looking for irrigation, they'll pay top dollar. If they want irrigation and there isn't, they're not going to give you full price. So I think, 10% is probably a great guess.
Yeah.
But there's so many variables in that. Water's a premium in this state. We're a dry state for the most part, and water is very valuable.
Water's like gold, isn't it?
Yep.
So I'm going to round us out real quick, and then we're going to get to my favorite part of the podcast. But I do believe that it's going to increase your value 10% if you have water rights. Now there is some caveats to that. That's just shooting from the hip a bit. But especially if you pipe that underground, you have a beautiful manicured yard. I mean, it could go up to 15 to 20%, depending on how well you use that. So sellers, owners, if you do not have water rights, or if you think you do, go investigate them because it really could make a swing in value. And heck, if you're in an area that you could get a well to water, do that. It's a big amenity. So on to the next thing. This is my favorite part of the podcast. It's called the Lyons Pride. The Lyons Group powers this podcast, obviously, and we have a lot of pride in what we do. We take pride in our community and how we affect our community to the positive. And so we take some time every episode to highlight an individual that's out in the community doing something great. And this week, I would like to highlight none other than our fellow peer and Realtor of the Year, Stephanie Buffington with San Juan Realty.
Yeah.
Right.
She did not, that is an award that you give or get, I should say, because you are awarded by your peers. It has nothing to do with production, although she does very well. But it is one thing that highlights how impactful she's been on the community. She always gives back to our community. So Stephanie, just want you to know we see you. We want to let you know we are proud of you. Continue to take steps in this community to make it better. And thank you for all you've done for San Juan County. So,
yes, great job, Stephanie. Wonderful
job, Stephanie. And Realtor of the Year. So next episode, you want to stay tuned. We're going to be discussing the silent war. Oh, it sounds ominous. It's going to be a good discussion. We're going to talk about all things legislation that affect real estate. You do not want to miss that episode. If you like this video, like it, comment. We'd love to hear topics of interest. We'd love to discuss those. Please request a free buyer's or seller's guide. We're happy to send that to you. Go to sjcbroker.com and you can find all the information. Contact any one of us. We would love to work with you in any type of real estate capacity. So thank you for tuning in. Until the next time, we're here at the Den. Thank you for listening to The Den, powered by the Lyons Group. Hit the subscribe button to keep informed on real estate happenings. If you'd like to learn more about the Lyons Group, visit sjcbroker.com. Complex markets require complex strategies. The Lyons Group can give you a true advantage in any market. Whether you're buying or selling, residential or commercial, contact us directly at sjcbroker.com. We're time-tested experts with a client-first approach, and we'll see you next time in the Den.